Nicola is currently the chair of HESTA, the Health and Community Sector Superannuation Fund, which is a fantastic partner of our community. And on behalf of the entire Our Community family, I'd like to thank HESTA for their ongoing support of not just our community and this conference, but the wider community sector. Nicola is also chair of Vic Health, Victoria's independent health promotion agency, and she is a non-executive director on 2 listed property boards and the board of the charity Health Justice Australia. Nicola was a member of the Australian Parliament for 15 years, representing Labor in the western suburbs of Melbourne seat of Gellibrand, where Dennis used to hand out those how to vote cards for you, Nicola. Elected at 31, she served as Australia's Health Minister for 4 years from 2007 and oversaw major reforms to Australia's public hospital, primary care and preventative health systems. In 2011, Nicola became Australia's first female Attorney General, overseeing the establishment of the Royal Commission into the Abuse of Children within institutions. Nicola has received national and international awards in recognition of her public health work, particularly in tobacco control. And Nicola, you showed such courage and determination globally in getting that done and in taking on the tobacco companies. I think the world owes you a big thank you. Nicola's personal and professional story was recorded in a documentary, Kicking the Habit, produced by the ABC's Australian Story. And originally trained as a lawyer, protecting the dignity of workers and promoting the standing of women has been an absolute hallmark of her career. Prior to entering Parliament, Nicola worked as an industrial lawyer, union organiser, and an associate to High Court Judge Mary Gaudron. I have known Nicola for quite a long time now and had the honour to call her a friend and have watched her transition from politics to be an amazing chairperson and director of leading Australian businesses and enterprises. We are so lucky to have Nicola here today to present the 2022 Joan Kirner Social Justice Oration. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Carol. I was a little bit worried that was actually going to be longer than my speech, because Dennis did warn me that this is the time where some of you are travelling, and I will try to shorten my comments a little bit so that we've got time for Q&A. But as I think Kathy said beforehand, if you need to go, don't forget I do come from Parliament, so I am used to people yelling and screaming when I talk, and if you just quietly walk out, I won't really notice. So please don't be worried if you have to do that. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I must say, being able to make that acknowledgement now with the sense that we are going to be able to, as a community, willingly and enthusiastically embrace the Uluru Statement of the Heart makes it feel even more special and exciting, and I think something important for us all to do. I'd like to acknowledge Ron. Ron, not every partner in life has an amazing oration with this history in the honour of their partner, and we all know that Joan really was an incredible person. And it's an honour for me to give this presentation in her name because she was inspiring to so many people. She broke so many stereotypes. She was such a powerful woman and a friend to so many people, including me. And I couldn't help thinking, coming here today, gosh, how much would she have enjoyed the weekend? All the things that she really cared about, a Labor victory, a vote for women, unashamed support for action on climate and integrity, more diversity and more Indigenous MPs. These were all issues that she cared about, worked for and had the vision to actually plan campaigns for decades ahead sometimes of others in the community. So I think it's really nice timing I did have a little moment a week or so ago where I thought it mightn't feel quite as great giving this speech if the outcome wasn't as positive. And so that's a nice reflection. And I think it's really an optimistic time to be asking ourselves whether and how we need to reframe and reposition some of our contemporary social justice campaigns in order to get more traction on them. And so I think it's great coming after particularly Osman's presentation that I think that did make me think about a lot of things and challenge us. And I think when we're in an audience full of people who work to improve our community, it's sometimes hard to ask the questions whether we're always targeting everything that we could be in the right way. Are we doing it in the smartest way? Are we doing it in the way that will actually deliver the results? And I think Joan would have expected nothing less of us. So I'm really keen to be able to take you through that. So just quickly, I am presenting today in my personal capacity, but I do have to tell you I am going to lean most heavily on my current role as the chair of HESTA. Let's see whether this works. And we're a health and community sector fund. We invest member money to get great returns for those members in their retirement, but we also do that in a way that gets great returns for the communities because we think that there is an important impact from smart investing. But before I sort of talk about the social justice issues that I'm keen to talk about, I wanted to just give a really big thank you and a shout out to your sector in particular and all of you, because I think the last couple of years have been hard for a lot of people, but really cannot be harder than anyone in the community sector where you've been coping with bushfires, COVID, floods, and of course all the different layers of stress on top of an already really difficult workload. So I want to thank you for the work that you all do in your sector and the people that you support and whose lives you make such a big difference to. Your sector makes up about 20% of HESTA's membership, so we value all of the interactions and getting to know more about you and your work every time we have the opportunity to work together. So I just wanted to say thank you to you and for the work that you do. Superannuation isn't really normally thought about as part of the whole social justice agenda, but it is fundamental and its purpose could not be more aligned because the core is to help elderly Australians have a safe, secure and satisfying retirement. And that universal system was designed particularly with those who had less wealth in mind to make sure that they were also entitled to a comfortable retirement. It became a compulsory part of our employment system when union campaigns started in different industries were adopted by a Labor government back in the 1980s. Some of you will be familiar with this, but I'm going to take you occasionally on the speech to a bit of history because I think I'm trying to set the context of where social justice agendas have most been placed in the Australian environment and where it might move into the future. So the Hawke-Keating government, they were unashamed about describing this as a component of what they called a social wage. And it came from the era when economic policy was still considered to be a tool of government policy and used to tackle inequality. It wasn't hived off into a sort of separate discussion about social policy. And so I want to quote a little bit, just to go back to the history. This is Emeritus Professor Carol Johnson reflecting in the conversation. She said, unlike in the US and the UK, where anti-union policies were pursued, the Labor government was prepared to work with the trade union movement to introduce its economic policies. Under the Accord agreements, trade unions agreed to wage restraint and eventually some real wage cuts in return for government services and benefits. And the Hawke-Keating government referred to this as the social wage. They clearly claimed that resulting increased business profits would encourage economic growth and rising living standards. And importantly, Keating saw his economic policies and progressive social policies as compatible. Increased social inclusion would contribute to economic growth. Drawing on the Hawke-era affirmative action legislation, Keating argued that improved gender equality would mean women could contribute their skills to the economy. And as some of you would know, those of us with more grey hair when it's not dyed, Keating was also a very passionate advocate for reconciliation with Indigenous Australians, including acknowledging the injustices of Australia's colonial past and facilitating native title. But he envisaged an Australia where Indigenous people could benefit from sustainable economic development cultural tourism, and could sell, for example, their artworks to the world. I wanted to read those few paragraphs because I think they reflect a deep understanding of the economic foundation of social justice and how other issues, whether it's gender equality or Indigenous rights that were mentioned in that quote, were part and parcel of that whole concept. Economic and social issues tied together in that overarching concept of social justice. And to me, when I read those descriptions, I sort of thought they sounded refreshingly sensible, because to today's ears, or at least mine, they're a bit surprising when we're living in a world where a lot of noise that we hear, particularly in the media, about which we could broadly put under social justice umbrella, is much more fractured, and it can be pushed to the margins, or it can be kept into the abstract. So my main hypothesis for today's oration is that broad social justice changes are most successfully pursued when they're articulated and explained as initiatives that have combined economic and social impact. A good example of this is in the recent election campaign, when childcare was talked about by Labor as both an equity policy for women, but also an economic policy for the nation, with benefits to both the individual and the whole society. And I think that made it a more powerful argument. I'm also going to explore the idea that it actually suits the opponents of change to keep those concepts as separate as they can. I think it's a technique that's being used a lot more to choose the ground to fight on, preferring to shoot down or exaggerate the more esoteric rights agenda rather than directly addressing practical inequities like low-paid jobs or unsafe housing, even though all of us, particularly in this room, know that the causes and solutions are deeply interlinked. So I'm here at an invitation, obviously, from our communities, and as I've said, and I think Carol mentioned as well, we feel that we're an important partner with the community sector. But it isn't going to surprise you that quite a bit of what I'm talking about today does draw on my time in government as the Health Minister and the Attorney General, because that gave me a different perspective on shaping and advocating for and delivering important social change. And the insights that I'm sharing really do very much reflect that government experience as well. I am a strong believer in government and the importance of government. I think governments really can change the country. But I do need to tell you that they never do it on their own. And I think that this sometimes can be missed. So I loved the campaign, including important things that were dear to my heart: commitments on pay justice for women, serious plan at last to tackle aged care staffing issues, and to support pay increases for the lowest workers. These issues really matter to people day in and day out. But despite my enthusiasm, I do understand that over the years there are a lot of people who actually are frustrated by what they think looks like a lack of ambition from governments when it comes to the broad social justice agenda. So it might be controversial, but I believe it's ultimately up to us, the community, to shape and drive the level of ambition that our political leaders have or do not have on any particular issue. Political parties, bureaucracies, and our federation all have inherent constraints that make it far less likely that they will be the innovators where good ideas will blossom within government rather than outside it. To properly tackle complex economic and social issues, we need a breadth of thinking and a depth of aspiration that needs to be deeply informed by the lived experience of Australians. And such insight, understanding and energy is mostly driven by the community, its needs and community expectations. I agree that good governments and good leaders will certainly tap into those innovative ideas raised from the outside, but their true strength is in making good choices from ideas, campaigns, research and advocacy that the communities create. The political skill, which I'm not understating here, is to sift those ideas and then drive them through the political process to become reality. So in this forum on social justice, where we're asking ourselves how we make our community more equal, safer, stronger, happier, the opportunity and challenge is back to us. What context do we create for political issues and debate? What ground are we making fertile for those important ideas to take seed and to grow? We're not passive in the way the future is shaped. This conference is called Communities in Control after all, so I'm pretty sure that Dennis has a strong message in there too. So I want to use a couple of examples to underline that. So this fabulous Every Australian Counts campaign, the creation of the NDIS was a true people power success. It was adopted enthusiastically by the Gillard government, definitely, but it was first imagined, brought to the forefront of debate and campaigned for by people, including in this room, through this very clever, very cohesive Every Australian Counts campaign. It was a grassroots campaign by people with disabilities, their families and advocates, and there was no way once that power was unleashed that our government or any other government was not going to adopt it as a policy. I do want to refer to the plain packaging, which was mentioned in the introduction. Now, there was really strong community support to introduce these plain packagings with horrible health messages on them. And it was very heavily supported by thought leaders and charities. And I actually feel like I get an embarrassing amount of credit for introducing this. It's true that I did take the step that made us the first country in the world, and I'm delighted that there are now 30 other countries around the world who have introduced this measure. And it was hard work to get it through the Parliament, and it was hard work to still stare down multiple legal challenges. But the idea actually came from a public health academic, and it was advanced very strongly by great organisations like the Cancer Council. And that was what enabled me to act on a difficult and contested issue. And just to show you what it might have looked like if decades of health ministers in Australia hadn't acted, this is what an ad for cigarettes currently looks like in Russia. So you forget the colours, the targeting of children, the design to get people attracted to these very addictive and dangerous products. And I also mentioned earlier superannuation. Initially, this was something that was just for wealthy public sector employees like public servants and academics, and it was the effort of the trade unions across industries that laid the groundwork for the Hawke and Keating government to introduce something as a universal compulsory employment right throughout our workplaces. So they're just a couple of examples that were initially driven by the community, not-for-profit organisations and civil society, and then adopted and implemented by governments. And they're all people power examples where smart organising, good research, good advocacy and strong civil society inputs laid the groundwork that raised the issues and did some of the thinking. And I have to say, Joan was an absolute expert at this. She actually got initially involved in politics through a grassroots campaign about education that exactly took this sort of approach. These weren't ideas that were created inside of government, but the government was responsive to needs identified, and that's, I think, really important. I believe, as I mentioned, that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is also going to prove to be such a campaign. Imagined and created by the Indigenous communities and leaders, and now ready to be pursued and adopted by a willing government. I do admit that my skin tingled a bit when Anthony Albanese made this his first comment in his Saturday night victory speech. And thank you. I think we can all contribute to making this become reality because it's such a powerful, thoughtful call to action, addressing the past, helping white Australia understand its history and navigating a better path forward. Proper Indigenous recognition is obviously well overdue, but I think the way this statement was developed by our First Nations leaders has really enhanced the momentum that can be acted upon and the ownership and pride we can all share in it. Climate change is a little bit of a more odd one for me in this frame that I'm putting to you because for the last decade, the debate on the issue has been so fractured and fractious within our parliament and within our parties that the community feels very frustrated. I think this weekend voters explicitly voiced their impatience on this issue as well. But it is an area where even with the extra momentum from the change of government and the success of teal independence, the truth is that action on climate change has been well underway in spite of, not because of, politics. Businesses, states, individuals and superannuation have been stepping in where political processes to date have failed. And I'm not going to talk to you in a lot of detail about it, but it is true that big investors like Hester have been driving change by investing in renewables and working with companies to hasten the transition to a cleaner economy. I want to just emphasise, though, that this isn't just about having money to do that and being a big investor. A fund like ours has nearly 1 million people as its members. And I think that gives us both the power and the responsibility to use our influence well. So again, as members, as the community, it shapes some of the actions that are taken. And there are plenty other areas too, ones that I know Carol has worked on for many years, and where Hester has taken a big advocacy role in the equality for women. I'm going to sort of skip through some of those things, so I think they may be better known to you, and also you've heard some presentations about them. But the point really is we've got great research that shows us why organisations that have women on their boards and in their senior leadership teams actually deliver better results. It's an indicator of a high performing company. So you get a good social outcome and you get a good economic outcome together. And they're the things that I believe we need to be looking for. So this is the good news. This is the good news, that you have the power to help bring about changes that make our society better. But action on the broader social justice agenda is still needed now more than ever. I'm really concerned that inequality is growing and has been overlooked by a lot of mainstream debate for far too long. In terms of income, the top 20% of households have nearly 6 times the income of the lowest 20%. But wait for it, when we look at wealth, not just income, it's even more staggering. The average wealth of the highest 20% of Australians is 90 times the wealth of the lowest 20% of Australians. And so although we like to imagine ourselves as the country of a fair go, these figures tell a really different story. And we don't even make it into the top half of the OECD countries when you measure inequality. We rank only 22nd out of 35 OECD countries. And I think many of us can see in our families, in our work, in our suburbs, in all sorts of different areas, that inequality, particularly generational inequality, is growing. We see new employment structures that deny workers basic security and poor safety. They make us worry that we are creating, if we haven't already created, a class of working poor. The cost of living, let alone the cost of housing, is bubbling to the forefront again, as many people really do reach breaking point. And this inequality is replicated across lots of different areas where you work. And to make all this sort of, it is very much more confronting if you are in the part of the society that feels the sharpest end of this. But I really want to emphasise, particularly to those of you, and I think all this room is, committed to social justice campaigning, actually this inequality matters to all of us. Not just because it's fair, but actually because highly unequal societies face much greater social problems. There are diverse impacts that are well measured in terms of health, life expectancy, imprisonment rates, mental health, and so much more. In fact, if you look at all the huge social upheavals of history, peasant uprisings, the French, Russian or Chinese revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, these were all about the economy, wages, living standards, and the distribution of wealth. And while they all had some different local drivers, the common thread was huge inequity. A very small number of people held most of the wealth while the broader population lived in abject poverty. So history tells us clearly what happens when societies ignore growing divides. It's why social justice matters to all of us, not only to those who are most in need, because it ultimately underpins national stability. And this is why we need to act on inequality and injustice when we see it. But when we see that inequality, how do we change it? We have to build understanding, we have to build alliances, we have to use social and economic levers, and we have to persuade governments and communities. I know this is a room full of people who spend their lives finding ways to do just that. So I hope this following reflection will just add to that insight, passion, expertise and experience that you already bring to the task. And I do want to flag a few barriers that I see that routinely delay or prevent our success, because I think sometimes when you're in the thick of it, it's harder to see what some of the blockages might be for the momentum for change. And I'm hoping that I have a slight helicopter perspective that might be useful. The current most powerful and most corrosive barrier I see is the deliberate tactic of isolating the social justice agenda into what I'm calling micro issues and diverting the focus of debate to the most thorny or most provocative edge of identity politics. For example, instead of addressing culture and identity as a crucial part of creating productive and inclusive workplaces, issues get turned into a debate about everyone else's, I use in inverted commas, freedom of speech. So we see reams of commentary and focus on issues like Israel Folau or kindergartens without Christmas trees, instead of focusing on safe workplaces free of vilification or inclusive childcare that assists mothers across all cultures seek employment. And I'm sure a few of you will have seen this, which is not just provocative. The danger is it actually feeds into the politics of division and envy. Not sure if you can all read that, but I'm pretty sure you get the fair idea. I actually heard Scott Morrison, do you remember he was the Prime Minister? Heard Scott Morrison theatrically describe identity politics as the balkanisation of politics the other day. And this seemed to me so ironic when he actually really thrived on that division. And the dog whistling on sensitive issues like trans women in sport was just the most recent but very deliberate use of this political tactic. And thankfully, I think the Australian public have comprehensively rejected it. But this sort of division and diversion can create roadblocks to positive change, and so can the politics of envy. And I think we need to be aware of this. We need to think about our language falling into the trap and actually feeding that division. So an example of this is the accusation that the inner city elites are only interested in promoting luxury beliefs. This was a theory created in 2019 by a Yale PhD candidate called Rob Henderson, and he coined the term to describe attitudes that operate as status symbols for the rich, but in practice are costly for the poor. So the theory is explained by, in the past, the upper middle class displayed their wealth via luxury goods such as fur coats, and today they signal their status with luxury beliefs. So this frames the positions of social justice advocates as out of touch with ordinary people. And the news article I read then provocatively put climate change into one of those categories of luxury beliefs. You know, that it's okay to have those beliefs if you're wealthy and live in a teal seat, but if your family's income relies on a coal mine, it isn't. Now, of course, I believe this is wrong-headed, but I think it isn't without resonance in our community, and I think we have to understand the way these techniques get used. And I find Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which many of you will be familiar with, as a really good tool to use to help consider why some social justice campaigns get less traction than others, and why some have the potential to fuel the politics of envy. I know you're not going to be able to read all of that in detail, but I'm pretty sure this audience is quite familiar with how the hierarchy works. And it articulates that a person's needs can be covered in this hierarchy, the foundational base from which all else is enabled, the bottom category, and then is for the most basic needs for survival, food, water, safety. And then you work your way up the pyramid through other needs such as shelter, health, employment, love, family, spirituality, and other fulfilment. So the descriptions occasionally differ. For my purposes today, it doesn't really matter. The concept just is, at its most basic, that survival needs have to be met before the individual will strongly desire or focus their motivation on the secondary or higher level needs of personal fulfilment, including love, identity, and happiness. I was at something recently where one of these was presented as a post-COVID version, which actually puts battery life and Wi-Fi as your survival needs, and then you can go to all the rest. I mean, the idea of a hierarchy is contested because, of course, we hope and want that a decent society will meet all these needs for all of us at the same time. But I do think the pyramid is a reminder, maybe even a warning, that the needs at the bottom of the pyramid are a crucial foundation. And if we talk about and pursue only those at the top without pursuing those in the foundation, I don't think our progress will be secured. And social justice change rarely comes about in the community if those core needs are neglected. So instead of creating a wedge of envy, we need to find alignment in causes that address the pressures that all sorts of communities are under. And we know from our own research, for example at HESTA, that over 50% of our members have a household income of less than $80,000. So we know that our members, your staff, people you service, really feel this hard edge of social justice issues. We might be a lucky country as a whole, but we certainly don't evenly share that wealth and luck. And COVID, I think, has revealed to the broader community, as I said before, our very own working poor, an underclass of young and mostly migrant workers whose conditions seem to be neither safe nor adequate. So I think this pyramid reminds us that advocating for decent income, support for homelessness, domestic violence, mental health, they still need to be prioritised and focused on. I think we have to take care if we use the language of rights and stop talking about how they're tied to these practical challenges. We could lose support for some of the much needed change. I think we saw a really interesting example of this play out in the US some years ago. I think Hillary Clinton fell into this trap when she made a throwaway line, you might remember in one of the debates, about Trump's deplorables. And this was possibly a pretty accurate description for some fairly ugly racism and sexism that had been displayed by some Americans, especially towards her. But it did sound terribly dismissive of the economic and social dislocation being felt by many Americans in the Rust Belt states, whose economies had really drastically changed their living standards and life prospects. And we do all know how that saga ended. So I think we also need to reflect after the election on the sort of tactics and attack that the United Australia Party used, similarly stoking the anger that the multicultural inner city is concentrating just on identity issues, while they argue that the working conditions of low-income families in the burbs are missing out on attention. So I think we have to take care to work out how we bridge that and straddle those issues and link them together. It doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue those issues in the top of the hierarchy, but it does mean we can't afford to ignore those at the bottom of the pyramid. Which leads me to repeat my conviction that this atomisation of issues is really playing into conservative hands. There are other examples, but I'm going to look to Dennis. I think we're okay for a little bit more time. Just had a couple of examples that I wanted to use about the success of combining both social and economic issues. Probably the most interesting one, I think, was the Hawke-Keating government being able to sort of modernise the economy, deal with industrial rights and equal opportunity, affirmative action, early environmental protections, a really healthy mix of social and economic. But I heard John Howard reflecting on this time and saying that the government, in his view, lost popular support when the community thought they were concentrating too exclusively on issues like the Republic and native title. In my era of earliest political awakening, the industrial arguments over equal pay for women, freedom from discrimination and harassment, they were very much couched as economic arguments, focusing on ensuring women could participate in the economy fully and provide for themselves. So the man is not a plan was a jargon at the time. And I think we need to just make sure we think about how we resist our broad issues and causes becoming too isolated and risk whether they'll be as effective. So we have to think about the challenge of how we raise all the important issues. Osman, I think, touched on lots of them in terms of race in our multicultural communities. But I think similarly we could say that with the LGBT plus communities. How do we tie these issues back to a more powerful force for bringing about change? I think we can link our issues to a stronger common cause. And I think when we look at the original description by the earliest philosophers of social justice, the issue became popularised in the Industrial Revolution when there was that huge gap between rich and poor. And I think one of our current challenges is how do we better articulate sexism, racism, colonialism or homophobia as fundamentally linked to generational and economic disadvantage. If we leave these issues unaddressed or ignored, it damages not just those communities but all of us. And we need to provide a vision for change that will empower and include people, allow them to be safe, fulfilled and engaged participants in our society and lead to the economic and social impacts that we all want. I think we need to find better language to explain the intergenerational impacts of trauma and social exclusion and how this can entrap individuals, families and cultural groups in cycles of poverty and alienation. breaking these cycles is really important for all of us. So I'm wondering and going to leave you with the thought that perhaps the pervasive nature of generational inequity will do this most effectively for us. Former Reserve Bank Governor Ian Macfarlane told The Australian this month that he was surprised that young people were not protesting in the streets, saying that the story of inequality of wealth in Australia is the story of incredible growth in property prices that has benefited older Australians at the expense of younger Australians. Young people and newer migrants are disproportionately affected. And considering the enormous impacts across as broad issues as homelessness, rental policies, housing supply, home ownership, it's pretty surprising that this generational inequality was pretty much ignored during the campaign. The political problem, of course, is the population is ageing very fast. So just when the disadvantage for young generations is increasing, the number of voters over 65 is rapidly growing and those under 30 dropping. So the solution will not easily be found in the bare politics of election day. And I think this might be a perfect example of why governments sometimes can't easily act, where support for difficult ideas has to be built outside governments. The community has to help lay the groundwork on this and other important equity issues that the nation must solve. And I think it's time for us to attack this cleverly. Civil society needs to build a campaign to adjust and realign the general generational division of wealth in Australia. Now, politically, I'm 100% sure that everyone is going to have an allergic reaction to even discussing this, perhaps even hyper-allergic. But civil society needs to grapple with this and similar ideas through research, advocacy, and to help our communities and leaders see how they could fairly and over time reduce this inequity. I agree with Mr. Macfarlane, who went on to say the chasm between how we tax wealth and capital gains compared to how we tax wages and salaries cannot keep being ignored. The inequity of generational wealth, housing stress, the new fractured employment market, a truly inclusive and productive society that can grapple with, amongst other things, a meaningful future for Indigenous Australians. It's a list of challenges and opportunities that I could really keep going on for such a long time. I haven't even started on disability or access or unemployment benefits or much more. But we have to build recognition and respect of identity, gender, culture and age as a necessary part of achieving a stable, inclusive, equitable and productive community. It's our job to find a way forward. The Social Justice Compact for the 2020s does need to be reframed and repositioned to take account of how all of these issues can be tackled in the modern era. So my conclusion is 5 things. We need to keep social and economic issues together in reframing today's social justice campaigns. We need to take time to explain how and why rights interact with practical measures that impact livelihoods and safety. We need to keep in touch with the community as it changes, using data and understanding the experience of different parts of our society. We need to remember the hierarchy of needs and never neglect its foundation. And finally, we shouldn't wait for governments to instigate reforms. We need to help them find solutions and shape and build community demand for it. So it's only 5 things, nothing much to it. Good luck.